My name is Sam, and I am 20 years old. I was born and raised in New Mexico, near the Navajo Reservation. Having spent my whole life there, many of my friends and family members have claimed to have had instances with the paranormal. I am a strong believer in the paranormal, but when I was 16, my perspective was quite different. At that time, I didn't believe in that stuff, and I found anything supernatural as something to joke about rather than fear. Of course, something happened to me that greatly changed my view on this subject. It all started on a day like any other. There are a few natural parks and reserves near my neighborhood. The sun was out, and I decided it would be a great idea to go for a walk in one of the reserves. In this reserve, the pathway starts as one main trail before going in 3 different directions a few miles in: straight ahead, left, and right. I walked down the trail and took the left path when I reached the crossroads. This path takes me through a small forest for about 10 minutes before leading to a dead end near a waterfall. Anyway, I started walking down the left path, and when I got about halfway through the small forest, I see it. There was a figure walking down the trail towards me. I couldn't make anything out at first, but as it got closer, I could make it out to be that of a middle-aged woman. She was walking toward me and seemed to have a bit of a limp. Her hair was a bit disheveled, and her face was red, as if she had been running. As we got closer to each other, she started looking at me, and I mean full-on staring. She didn't say anything, but she had a look on her face like I had just committed murder. When we passed each other, she didn't break her gaze. Even when I had my back to her, I could still feel her eyes on me. I took a quick look over my shoulder and saw that she had craned her neck so that her gaze was still fixed upon me. I continued walking down the trail, feeling chilled, but dismissed it as some drug addict or something. The next day, I was spending the night at my best friend Steve's house. He had told me that he had just bought a brand new Call of Duty game, and I couldn't wait to try it out. We played the game for a few hours, then ordered a pizza. While we were eating, we heard some rustling in the bushes outside the living room window. We dismissed it as the wind at first, but then we heard tapping on the window. We went over to the window and looked outside, but we couldn't see anything. Steve thought it was a ghost, but I just laughed it off and told him it was the bush rubbing against the window. As we continued playing the game, the incident quickly faded to the back of our minds. A couple of days later, things got weirder. I was 16 at the time, as I said, so of course my main priority was getting my driver's license. I had just gotten my license, so one day I decided to take the car out for a spin. I was driving through a remote area of town when I noticed a figure in the distance. It appeared to be a young man walking along the road. He was coming toward me, but as I got closer, I noticed his features. His hair was a complete mess. There was a gash on his left shoulder. His clothes were torn and dirty, and his face looked scratched and stained with blood. It looked like he had been mauled by something. When I came closer to him, he gave me the same cold look as the middle-aged woman I saw in the reserve. He craned his neck just like the woman while staring at me like I committed some heinous crime. After I got away from him, I quickly got onto a busier road with sparse traffic. Just being around other people seemed comforting to me. Little did I know that this was far from the end. The next couple of days weren't very eventful. I saw no more weird people on the streets staring me down, but if I were in my room getting ready for bed, I would occasionally hear tapping on my window. My bedroom is on the first floor, so it's more likely that someone will come to my window. But every time I looked, all I would see was the street with the lamppost casting an orange glow over it. It was weird. Again, I saw no more people giving me cold stares, but nevertheless, whenever I was out by myself, I felt like I was being watched. Every time I looked behind me, I was alone. I didn't know if there was something wrong with me or if I was really being stalked. I never saw anyone watching me from afar or any cars slowly trailing behind me, so I had no idea what was making me feel this way. Things escalated one night. I was in my room getting ready for bed when once again I heard tapping on my window. By this point, there had been tapping on my window at least once, sometimes twice each night, always around the same time. At first, I chalked it up to a branch rubbing against the window, but now I was starting to get creeped out. But tonight, when the tapping came, it was accompanied this time with a faint cackling type laugh. I of course knew that someone was at my window. I went over to the window, and with one instant boost of courage, I thrust up the blinds. What I saw is what I still see every time I close my eyes. It was the same woman I saw at the reserve. She was standing right on the other side of the glass, arms flat to her sides, head tilted like a dog, staring at me. Her eyes were open wider than I thought possible, and she was giving me an insane-looking smile. I screamed and fell to the floor in fear. When I looked back at the window, she was gone. My parents burst into my room and asked me if I'd lost my mind. I told them what I saw, but they dismissed it as me just seeing things. They even began lecturing me about staying up too late. I have mild insomnia, so I am often up late at night. I went to bed feeling very shaken, not knowing what to think. Things took a huge turn for the worse a few days later. I was driving down a desolate road late at night. It was one of those back roads made entirely out of dirt and gravel running through a forest. I don't remember most of the trip, but I do remember that it was completely pitch black outside since there were obviously no lights. Anyway, as I was driving, I began to see several shapes in the distance. They became clearer as I got closer. I saw a small pack of coyotes standing in the middle of the road. There were about 3 or 4 of them, and they were crowded around something lying in the dirt. Coyotes are scavengers, so it seemed that something got run over and they were picking at what was left. As I got closer, all 4 of the coyotes turned and looked at me. For whatever reason, a sinking feeling of dread overtook me as I looked into their glowing eyes. I snapped out of it and began to drive around them, and as I passed them, their eyes continued to stare. When I had completely passed them, I looked back through my rearview mirror. They were still looking at me, but they were also growling. They soon began to run after my car. I knew they couldn't do anything to me when I was still in my car, but I still floored it away from them. After a few minutes of driving, I suddenly had to go to the bathroom very badly, so I pulled over and went into the woods to do my business. When I finished, I was just about to turn back to the car when I heard footsteps and howling coming from behind me. I turned and saw 4 pairs of eyes glowing in the moonlight as the coyotes came into view. I didn't know why they were following me, but before I could think about this further, all 4 of them stood up on their hind legs and sprinted at me faster than Olympic runners. They knocked me to the ground and stood over me. Before I could get away, the closest one let out a terrible sound that sounded like someone screaming as their lungs are filling with liquid. All 4 of them began to sink their jaws into me, and everything faded to black. I woke up screaming in a cold sweat. What an insane dream. It felt so real. I sat in bed for a few moments, collecting my thoughts, when I heard something in the distance. I heard 2 or 3 pairs of footsteps moving past my house, followed by howling and barking. It sounded like there were some wolves walking around outside. I got out of bed and walked over to the window and lifted the blinds. I couldn't see anything out there, not even any glowing eyes. I dismissed it as the sounds from my dream echoing into reality and went back to bed. A few days later, the most horrifying thing happened to me. I was with Steve at the time. We were walking down a trail at the local reserve. Ironically, it was the same reserve in which I had my first encounter a week or so ago. Anyway, I digress. We were walking down a meandering path further in the reserve through a large forest. I think we were talking about Star Wars and some other science fiction movies, when we heard rustling in the bushes to our right. Then, like every horror movie ever made, we heard a scream in the distance. It sounded like a young woman. "Help me! Somebody, please help me!" Steve and I looked at each other, and I could tell he wanted to run just like I did. The woman continued to scream for help, but as we listened, I realized they sounded strange. It seemed as though each scream sounded a little too similar to the one before it, and the more screams we heard, the more distorted they became. Steve said to me, "Let's get out of here, man." I agreed, but before we could turn and run, we heard the sound of something crashing through the underbrush. Something big. I snuck a peek over my shoulder and held in the urge to scream myself. There was a tall, hulking figure standing on its hind legs, staring intently at us with pale eyes. It seemed human-shaped, but at the same time didn't. Its arms and legs seemed way too long for its body. Its torso and limbs were very skinny, to the point where we could see bones underneath. There were razor-sharp, blood-stained claws on its upper feet, and hooves on the lower pair. A huge pair of antlers were sticking out of its head, and the face. Oh God, the face. Seemed like a combination between a wolf's and a human's face, but it was twisted and warped. It stared at us for what seemed like eternity, but in reality was only a couple minutes. All at once, it let out a gut-wrenching scream, the same scream the coyote made in my dream. My blood froze to ice, and Steve, in reaction to the scream, shouted, "Oh my God!" We turned and ran faster than either of us had run in our lives. As we were running, I heard an oh-so-familiar voice coming from behind us. "Oh my God!" It was Steve's voice, but Steve was in front of me. That only made me run faster. We ran all the way back to my place, and didn't stop until we got inside and locked all the doors and windows. We had a long talk about what happened in the reserve. Steve and I had no idea what that thing was that we saw. Steve didn't want to go home, and I wasn't about to go to bed by myself since my parents were out at the time, so Steve spent the night on my couch. About a month after the last encounter, Steve and I were talking to an old Navajo man on the reservation. He was an old friend of my family and very superstitious. We were just talking about the news, happy small talk, etc., when Steve out of nowhere brought up the encounter. The old man immediately went pale. He asked me if that was the only encounter, so I told him everything that happened, including the crazy dream. The old man told me that I was being stalked by a skinwalker. He said that a skinwalker is a type of witch that can shapeshift from humans to animals. They are also known to repeat the last words of their victims, which is quite effective since their last words are usually desperate screams for help. Steve and I didn't know what to think. After he finished, he gave us this Navajo totem and told us that it would keep the skinwalker at bay. Nothing has happened since, and it's been 4 years now. Steve and I often talk about this encounter, and I occasionally have nightmares about being chased by that monster. We still live in the same town where this happened, and we are both considering moving. Even with the totem, I don't know if I can handle the constant fear and paranoia of being stalked by something so inhumane. To this day, I'm constantly looking over my shoulder whenever I am outside alone, half expecting to see that distorted face and pale glowing eyes looking back at me. What's up, everybody? This is the Lone Wolf here. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you guys enjoyed this Skinwalker story. As always, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and hit the bell for notifications and join the Lone Wolf Pack. If you guys want to send me a message, there will be links in the description for my email and my Twitter account. So if you guys have any personal scary stories or creepypastas that you want me to read, send me a recommendation and I'll use your story in a future video. There will also be links in the description for the music artists that I use in this video, as well as the specific tracks in case you're interested in the music. And finally, if you guys have any constructive criticism for me, feel free to leave me a comment. I'm always looking for new ways to make this channel better, and all ideas are more than welcome. Until next time, you guys, stay spooky. And remember, the hunt begins when the moon is full. Sweet dreams.